Hello and welcome to the podcast series Care About Conversations, raising awareness about the issues and challenges facing family carers who combine work and care by engaging with employers, HR professionals, employee representative organisations, family carers and the research community. My name is Brian Doyle. I'm the podcast series producer and a researcher with the Care About Project, a collaboration between University College Dublin and Family Carers Ireland, funded by the Health Research Board. The overall aim of the Care About Research Project is to promote health and self-care among working family carers. And over the course of this podcast series, we will have conversations with those who have a role to play in supporting working family carers and begin to tease out the challenges and issues facing them and their employers.
So I'm joined today by David Grayson, the author of a book, Take Care, How to Be a Great Employer for Working Carers. So good morning, David, and you're very welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'm not going to ask you what the book is about, because actually I think it definitely does what it says on the tin. But what I would like to ask you is, what inspired you to write this book?
So several things inspired me, Catherine. First off, for 8 years, I had the pleasure and the privilege of chairing Carers UK. So an organisation I think quite well known to you and your colleagues. And during that time, I got to know the work of Employers for Carers, which is one of the particular initiatives of Carers UK, going back to the early 2000s. And as essentially what Employers for Carers is trying to do is to help organisations, whether they're businesses or in the public sector or the third sector, to be better employers for the men and women who are on their workforce, who are juggling their job and caring for a loved one. And at the same time, my day work was and is as a professor of corporate responsibility, and I also advise various organizations around the world about how to be responsible businesses. And of course, a fundamental part of being a responsible business is taking responsibility for your impacts in the workplace and hopefully being a great place to work. And so it was both my volunteering work and my day job, but also it was because I was for a number of years myself a working carer. First of all, looking after or helping my mum to look after my late dad. And then after he died and his mum was getting a bit frailer and growing older, helping to look after her and looking after her eventually. So it was those really three sets of experiences: my volunteering work, my day job, and my own personal experiences as a working carer.
And then tell me, from your perspective, why should businesses and employers be aware of and support working carers?
So I think any organisation nowadays is facing what we classically call the war for talent, and particularly how do you make sure that you can attract the most talented people, make the most of them, and keep them in your organisation? And if you think about it, the peak age when you're likely to be working and caring for a loved one is going to be 40s through to early 60s. Very often, of course, we talk about this as people who are sandwich carers, looking after kids or grandchildren, perhaps, and at the same time looking after elderly parents or other elderly relatives. And those are very often some of the people that are the most experienced in an organization, and therefore the least likely or the least desirable to lose all of that experience. So if an employer can make the work more flexible, can make all kinds of reasonable adjustments and so on to help more of their employees who are juggling their job and caring for a loved one to be able to stay in work, then that's a win for the employer. I also passionately believe it's a win for the employee because people can stay in the job market. They, of course, have the income, but also they have all of the socialization that so many carers have said to me they so missed when they had to give up work to look after mum or dad or whoever. And I also happen to think it's better for the person being cared for, because if you've got all kind of chit chat and news about what's happening at work and so on to chat with when you go and look after whoever you're caring for, then that's just extra things to talk about. And we all know that if you're caring for somebody day in, day out, then sometimes what's the fresh items of conversation that you can introduce? And so I think also it's good for the person cared for to see that the person that they love and is looking after them and loving them has other things that they're doing.
Absolutely. I think from our perspective, we see time and time again the isolation that family carers feel. They talked about it over COVID. We've been cocooning for years before COVID ever came. So I think to be able to remain in the workplace and keep that interaction, as you said, that social interaction, but also that financial income coming in is so important.
Precisely. And so many of the members of Carers UK used to say to me when I was chairing the organisation that if they had to give up work, they became more socially isolated anyway. But there was a further factor, which is they didn't have so much money, so they couldn't afford, even if they had the time, they had somebody else who would provide respite care and so on, they didn't have the money to go out and socialise with friends in the same way. And so very often they'd say, no, I ended up making all kind of apologies for the fact that even though I desperately would love to have gone out with my friends, I couldn't afford it. So that's an extra very practical reality of the isolation that comes if you do have to give up work.
Yes, it is. So then what do you think carers need from employers to support them in combining their caring role with their job, paid job?
Yes. Yes, very important that we understand that there's a very, very big job in being a carer. It's just one that isn't paid for. Mm-hmm. So I think first off, the organisation needs to show empathy and understanding. And of course, if the organisation is trusted by its employees generally, if it has a good reputation for being a fair place to work, a decent place to work generally, that's going to be so much easier than if it's a low trust organisation. So we can't think about these questions of support for working carers in isolation from the broader issues about, is this a responsible organisation? Is it run ethically? Is it run fairly for its different stakeholders? So let's take that as a given for the time being. And so then I think the organisation needs to make the case for why it would like to hear from employees if they are a working carer or if they think they're about to become a working carer. The organisation, I think, has to make the case, because I've had lots of working carers say to me the last thing that with their particular employer they want is for that employer to know of their personal situation, because they fear that they would be victimized. They might be the first person on the list if there has to be redundancies. They're less likely, they fear, to get promotion and so on. That's a low trust organization. So the employer needs to make the case that if it knows accurately who its working carers are, where they are in the organization, it can be more kind of proactive in planning what is needed. I'm sure you're the same, Catherine, so many people over the years who have said to me, if only I knew at the beginning of my caring journey all the things I know now, how much easier life would be. And so I think the second thing, and part of the case for why the organisation wants to know who its working carers are so that as part of the organisation's intranet, its employee assistance programme, etc., it can make appropriate information available, both about the organisation's own policies in relation to working carers, but also can hopefully make the links to organisations like yours, like Carers UK in the UK and so on. So that's the second thing I think organizations need. So first off, the empathy, the understanding about the fact that so many people in an organization will typically be working carers, the information. I think one of the crucial things is having some flexibility. So many people have also said to me, it's so much easier if I know that the organization trusts me to get my work done, but is less interested in whether I do it 9 to 5 or whether some of it I do in the evenings after the person I'm caring for has gone to bed, etc., etc. So I think being an organization which is prepared to be flexible. And of course, COVID-19, the pandemic, all the lockdowns, enforced working from home has completely transformed the work environment anyway. And organizations are now having to rethink the whole nature of when do we need people in a kind of our organized workplace, et cetera, et cetera. I happen to think that completely remote working for most people isn't appropriate. And I don't think actually many of us who are working carers or have been working carers would want to be entirely remote workers, even if we could do our job effectively, because we want the socialization, we want the be able to get the updates about what the organization is up to and so on. And you don't get all of that through Zoom meetings or through briefings on the internet or whatever. But flexibility, I think, is really important. I think the good employers are now, in addition to offering flexible working from day one, rather than, as is the case in the country I know best, the UK, you can apply for it after 6 months. It should be automatic, I think, and good employers already do that, as I say. But also being prepared to think about some extra days for carers leave. And at the least, that's unpaid, but preferably it's paid leave. So organizations like Centrica in the UK, which runs British Gas for many years, have been offering additional days of holiday for carers if they are registered with the organization, so that you don't have to use up all of your holiday entitlement, hopefully, taking mum or dad or your disabled husband or whoever it is that you're caring for to doctor's appointments or to a dentist visit or whatever it may be. Because the reason why organizations use holidays is so people can recharge batteries, and that's so important. And if all of those holiday days are being taken up with more of the caring work, that's not holiday.
Absolutely. And I know the new EU Work-Life Balance Act, which will be applicable here in Ireland, offers 5 days, and a country can decide whether they will be paid or unpaid. Hopefully, Ireland will decide paid, but we will see. That commences in August, by the end of August this year. You've touched on probably the 7 steps to being a good employer, at least some of them there, I think, in that response.
And just to explain, perhaps, Catherine, for folk who haven't had a chance to read Take Care, How to Be a Great Employer for Working Carers, I used a 7-step model, which is something that I'd used in some earlier books about how to embed responsible business practices and sustainability in your business. And I decided it could also be used in this particular context.
Very good, very good. And can those 7 steps be applied to SMEs, large organizations? Does that work equally well in all, I suppose?
I think it does. And in many respects, of course, and when I was doing a lot of interviews for preparing the book, I spoke to a number of people running smaller businesses, and they made the point absolutely correctly that in a small business, if you have, say, 20 or 30 employees, losing one or two people to their caring responsibility is even more disastrous, especially if they are highly experienced people with a lot of institutional memory, etc., etc. It's even more disruptive to lose them. So the smaller organization, paradoxically, needs even more to be a great employer for their working carers, and actually probably finds it easier to do that because those smaller organizations where everyone knows each other, they can do all kinds of good workarounds. And I heard some really great examples where a husband needed to go back from his office every lunchtime to check in on his disabled wife and so on that he was caring for. And organizations who know people, their co-workers so well, can do that and make those kind of practical arrangements so much more effectively.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think what COVID has taught us is that we don't need to be doing things 9 to 5, and we don't need to be sitting in an office every day of the week to get work done. And actually, productivity can be far higher when we offer that flexibility as an employer as well. What resources and supports do you think could be applied to carers who are their own bosses? So maybe self-employed or a business person, to enhance the working carer role.
So one of my great friends and colleagues off and on for more than 30 years, a lady called Melody McLaren, who's, I'm pleased to say now, coming towards the end of her doctoral studies in Cranfield University in her 60s. And I first started working with Mel in business in the community in the UK back in the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s. So we go back a long way. And Mel had to give up full-time employment and go self-employed back in the early 2000s in order to care for her late husband, who developed and sadly increasingly was facing the challenges of living with Parkinson's, and Mel was a fantastic carer to him. And we would have lots of conversations when she was one of the researchers with me in the Cranfield School of Management. And of course, I was hearing real time her experiences alongside my own experiences as a working carer, and she was giving me some help with the Take Care book too. And eventually we were chatting one day and I said, it'd be really good if you could include some of what you've just been talking to me about in terms of some of the coping mechanisms and the survival tips and techniques that you've developed over the last few years, if we could include those in the book. Because whilst the book is principally aimed at employers, so it's aimed at general managers, at people running HR departments, particularly people running leadership development, top talent development, etc. But recognizing also that for quite a lot of working carers, their boss is themselves. Mm-hmm. They're self-employed, as you say. So trying to think and extrapolate a bit from Mel's experiences and some of the kind of the practical things that you can do. And I think one of the things that I've learned is the importance of building up support networks and thinking about circles of care. And we now have a social movement in the UK called Social Care Futures, which is all about getting the individual carer and the person cared for to think more broadly about who is in or could be in a circle of caring, both paid care workers, but also family and friends, neighbors, and so on. And how do you spread the workload, and how do you engage people in ways that work for them? So I think that's important. Just back on guidance for employers, then one of the very practical things that I've seen a lot of organizations do successfully, and one of the things that Employers for Carers encourages people to do, is to set up a network for your working carers amongst your employees, just like lots of organizations nowadays have networks for disabled employees, or for employees from the LGBTQ plus community, or from the BME community. So having those employee-led networks. So you'll see my backdrop this morning is Leonard Cheshire, the Pan Disability Charity, because I'm now, having been timed out at Carers UK, I've now become the volunteer chair at Leonard Cheshire. And just this time last week, I was having a wonderful call with a group of our disabled employee network representatives in Leonard Cheshire, where they were talking about some really practical things that they wanted to see Leonard Cheshire adopting in our own procedures. So disabled employees networks can both be a great source of information and encouragement and support for new working carers, people, because all the time, obviously, there's that constant turnover of people becoming a carer for the first time, and also people coming to the end of their caring journey, either because the person no longer needs care, or perhaps sadly because the person cared for has passed away. The other thing that disabled employees networks can do very effectively is that they can give all kinds of advice to their employer as well.
Absolutely. And I think we know ourselves as well that shared experience, sometimes just speaking to somebody else who's either going through it or has gone through it, is just so important, because they get it, and that, I think,
exactly,
that is crucial for people.
Exactly, because people don't, by and large, we're all different, and some people can devour written information and so on, and information on a website, and all of that, of course, is really important. But we are also ultimately social beings, and so having that chance, and one of the things that Carers UK did very successfully during the worst of COVID-19 lockdowns and so on, was to do online kind of cuppers for carers, and just a sort of set time for 30 or 45 minutes, and people were encouraged before they came on the call to make themselves a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or what have you, and just to sit down and to chat. And I joined when I was still chairing Carers UK. I joined several of these, and it was just nice just to be able to hear people coming in from all over the country and just chatting. Sometimes it was just chatting about the weather, because as we know, British people love to chat about the weather. But sometimes it was something in the news or something really positive that had happened to somebody. And sometimes, of course, it was somebody having a really difficult day and just being able to share what they were feeling, and other people being able to say, oh gosh, I feel like that every week almost, or whatever it might be. And just that sense that you are not alone.
Absolutely.
Which is why, of course, for employers, it doesn't have to be big, expensive policies and practices. Some of it can be really very low ticket items, but encouraging a really good network of employees. And I'm a huge fan of an organization called Purple Space, which is a kind of network of disabled employee networks, and it identifies and shares good practice amongst their members. I was having a drink the other night with Kate Nash, the wonderful social entrepreneur who set up and runs the Purple Space, and she was telling me that they are now almost up to 200 different organizations internationally. So maybe some of the HR folk who are listening to this podcast, they might be interested in Googling Purple Space and Disabled Employees Networks and thinking, oh gosh, that would be good for us to join and to learn from, because they've got lots of practical experience.
Excellent.
So, I hasten to say I'm not on retainer from Kate, but I'm a huge fan.
Well, we Family Cares Ireland will have a look at that as well, because it does sound really interesting. We mentioned COVID, it came up there, and I suppose like yourselves, Family Cares Ireland, we would have had our coffee mornings every Thursday, and we would have had guests in, and sometimes, as you said, just carers speaking to one another, saying, how is your week going? How do you think COVID has impacted on the strategies for employers and business that you have outlined in your book? Has it changed that much?
So I haven't really had a chance to look in detail. What I would say, and I think we've been saying this to each other earlier in the conversation, Catherine, that clearly organizations all over the world, large and small, are having to rethink their whole approach to flexible working, hybrid working, and so on. Very early on in the COVID-19 crisis, I did a conversation with somebody who works for Deloitte in Sydney, who is a specialist in thinking about new ways of working and so on. And they've been obviously doing a lot of thinking even before COVID-19 about the future of work and the future of workplaces and the future of kind of work organization. So not just what's the physical place where people work and what's the dynamics of those physical workplaces, but also how people are supervised in their work and so on. And I think lots of the trends and developments that were being seen in embryo before COVID-19 has massively speeded up. If you think most of us had to pivot more or less overnight from the old ways of working to some very, very new ways of working. And so I hope that a lot of the innovation that we saw during the last 2 years of the pandemic, we're not going to lose. We try and codify, and we really sort of use the fact that we've just had this very, very difficult 2 years. If we're going to get something positive coming out of it, it should surely be organizations rethinking about how can we be a highly efficient, highly productive, highly customer responsive, customer focused organization, et cetera, and at the same time be a really great place for people to work, including for the, obviously it depends from country to country, but roughly 1 in 7 people, more in some other countries like Canada, those employees who are juggling their job and caring for a loved one, and how we support them effectively as part of rethinking the way we work.
Very good. And actually that probably leads into what you will be glad to hear is my last question. What do you believe are the most essential societal changes that need to happen to create an enabling environment for employers of working family carers?
Gosh, that is a really big last question. Nothing like a nice, easy one, Catherine, to ease us out of the conversation, is it? So I think the most important thing is for societies around the world to recognize the huge importance of family carers, and to recognize that for most of us, this will be part of the cycle of life. Because all too often, for many people, it seems to come up unawares on them. And very often they take on their caring responsibility with a sense, gosh, I'm very much alone now, and the people in my social circles, in my work environment and so on, don't really understand what I'm going through. Of course, we know that's not true because so many of us are carers. Rosalind Carter, who Jimmy Carter's wife, the ex-American president, she has this wonderful quotation that I've used so many times, and it's in the book. There are only 4 kinds of people. The people who have been caregivers, the people who will be caregivers, the people who are caregivers now, and people who will need care at some point. And the more that we can raise awareness that this is a really important part of life. Now, as I look back, and my mum sadly died now 7 years ago, nearly. But I think one of the most important things that I've done in my life was making sure that her last few years she could spend safely and happily in the way that she wanted to do, which was here in the home from which I'm doing this podcast with you today, just outside Sheffield. And I think we need societies to recognize that caring is just a fundamental part of what it is to be a human. And then I think employers will see this as an integral part of being a great place to work, to be able to support their working carers. There are then practical legal changes. We've talked about the EU directive. Sadly, the UK, for the time being, is not directly impacted by that. And the legislation that we were anticipating around carers' leave is put on hold. We will see whether a new British government in the next few weeks takes a different view. Hopefully it will do. So there are practical things that government legislation and so on can do, but I think the most important thing is societal recognition of the important role that family caregivers play in any society, irrespective of the strength or otherwise of the welfare state and the paid care services.
Absolutely, and I often use Rosalind Carter's quote as well, and we often point out that at some point in our lives we'll either provide or require care. So there is no doubt this is a whole of society issue. And you're right, it often creeps up on somebody, unfortunately, if there's an accident or if a loved one is diagnosed maybe with long life illness or terminal illness. So for us as well, it's so important that awareness is out there, that people know who family carers are and their huge contribution to our health services as well. In Ireland, we say carers save, they save 20 billion euro every year. It's huge. And part of the challenge can be that whole self-identification issue as well, getting family carers to recognise I am a mom or a dad or a son or a daughter, but I'm also a carer. So that's really important, I think, in terms of awareness as well.
It is so much. I so agree with you, Catherine, and I think it's also important to recognise that this is an equal opportunity for men and women.
Yes.
Which is why I always thought it was important. Normally in profiles in books and things, you are thinking, right, oh gosh, I need to profile more women on this. But actually in my Take Care book, I deliberately tried to find more men who were combining their work and caring for a loved one. So for instance, the company secretary of Sainsbury's, the retailer, to make the point that this is something that should be shared between men and women.
Absolutely. Our own CEO of Family Carers Ireland is a family carer himself. And in Ireland, the figures, it's about 62% female, 38% male, and that those figures are rising all the time for male carers. So it is absolutely both genders, and it is an issue that you're right, we need to highlight as well. I'm not going to take any more of your time, David, other than to say thank you so much. I haven't got to read the full book, but I am absolutely going to get your book and read it straight away, because I think everything you've said today makes so much sense. And I think anybody and everybody should go out, get that book and read it. So thank you so much.
Catherine, thank you. Thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. Take care.
We've reached the end of our Carework conversation for this episode. I'd like to thank you for listening. If you'd like to hear more from us, please subscribe to Carework Conversations on your podcast platform of choice, or alternatively, you will find us at carewellproject.com or across our various social media channels, which are linked in our podcast feed. We'd also like to hear from you, our listeners. Please feel free to leave any comments, feedback or suggestions you may have on any of our social media feeds, or you can contact us directly at carewell@ucd.ie. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to you joining us on future Carewell Conversations.